Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2022. This is the 2022 version of an event that Vin at Revenant Reads created last year, designed to celebrate Star Trek fiction. And this year, I think wisely, we've abbreviated the event from 5 months to 2. I don't think 5-month BookTube events work. I didn't really know that back then, but I definitely think that's true now. 2 is much better, much more handleable, and that would have been fine if I'd stuck to only one of those 2 months. So the first month was to read in the normal, real Star Trek, the Roddenberry era Star Trek, anywhere in those 5 shows that were on TV decades ago. And September is not that. September is Strange New Worlds, where you go elsewhere, where you read either non-canonical Trek that is made just in the novels, that has no reflection of any kind, no roots of any kind on anything on the screen, the big screen or the little screen, or you read something that was generated by so-called New Trek, the 5 new Star Trek shows that are currently on TV, or the J.J. Abrams lens flare movies, something like that. And fool that I am, I decided to try the latter. I tried to read the fiction that was generated by stuff that is either not part of Roddenberry's continuity or flagrantly in contradiction of it. And there's not much. It's a week's worth of reading to get through all of it, and I did. And none of it is any good, which is hardship number 2. None of it is any good. The cynical side of me wants to say that the reason that none of the fiction is any good is because the shows aren't any good. But that's too broad a brush. There's nothing good in Star Trek Discovery, but there are good things in Star Trek Picard. I think that there are some very good things in Star Trek Prodigy, cartoon Star Trek. The humor on Star Trek Lower Decks doesn't work for me at all, but like pretty much everybody, I love Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Who knows if I'll continue to love it in Season 2. My naturally doomy South Boston Irish Catholic prediction is that Season 2 to Strange New Worlds will be the season that the showrunners tricked all the old fans into loving the show in order to foist upon them. The showrunners hate Star Trek fans. Hate them. I've been pretty open about that in interviews. Hate them. Consider them to be literally worse than Hitler. To be fascist, to be sexist, racist, transphobe, xenophobe, whatever, colonialist, all that sort of thing. They also hate Star Trek. Which is kind of weird that they would climb over the dead bodies of their relatives to get control of it, unless you realize that the control is what they wanted in order to destroy it and remake it in their own image. So the cynical part of me says that the reason why the novels are all bad is because of that attitude. And that therefore the reason that Star Trek Strange New Worlds was so odd, everybody who watches New Trek said it. Everybody commented, wow, this feels like Star Trek. None of the rest of it did, but this feels like Star Trek. This is really, really good. It's energetically acted. It's bright and optimistic. It's an ensemble team. It's got science and wonder and science fiction that isn't just throw some science at it. How on earth could the same people be responsible for this show that were responsible for anything in Star Trek Discovery? My own conspiracy theory, which may not be true, I'm hoping that it isn't. My own conspiracy theory is that this show was made in mockery. That somewhere there was a creative meeting at Paramount with showrunners and writers saying, let's give these neck-bearded fascists exactly the kind of whiz-bang, pew-pew-pew stuff that they like. We'll draw them in with only a little bit of our completely correct moral worldview. And then in the second season, once we've got them, we'll start to teach them in earnest. They're horrible people, and their grandparents were horrible people. But maybe they can be educated, maybe they can be better. But first we have to lure them in, because, the tide of history is on our side, and it's so hard dealing with all of these quasi-Nazi troglodytes. I think that was the attitude that resulted, oddly enough, in a great season of Star Trek. If it was, I don't think they have the patience to wait more than one season. So if I'm right, if that conspiracy theory is right, then Season 2 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds will be immediately revert to Star Trek Discovery style woke lecturing and not be anything else. We shall see. I would very much like to be wrong about that. I'd very much like to think that the star of the show, Anson Mount, would walk if he started getting scripts like that, but maybe not. But I ran out of new Trek stuff to read, unless I were to go, and read everything on fanfiction.net and Wattpad and all of that. I've read a great deal of that fanfiction, but I haven't read it all. It gets a little thin. I'm a big fan of fanfiction, don't get me wrong. There's plenty of my fanfiction on fanfiction.net, but most fanfiction is simply notebook jotting, and I read that. I like it. I like watching the community. I like watching people say I'd really like to hear comments, and I like reading the comments that they get. But it isn't satisfying as reading fiction. So there's only so much of it I can take. So I haven't read all of it there. But I ran out of all the professionally vetted stuff, and it was all awful. And you might think that would mean that my Strange New Worlds part of Book Trek is over, that it ended before the month ended. But I have a kind of a loophole. I am going to finish out the month with Captain Pike. Only, since there's no Strange New Worlds novels yet, I have gone back to his appearances in Roddenberry-era Trek, which is the smallest, the slimmest of all technicalities, but I'm going to take it. And I'm rereading. I reread last night a book that I think I read it for last year, for Book Trek. And I read it, of course, when it first came out, 40 or 50 years ago. And this is The Rift by Peter David. An old Star Trek novel. You see it's numbered. They had the numbers up there. They had the 3-line border. And you see two figures on the cover here. An older Jim Kirk, in his post-Admiralty days, when he has been demoted to captain. And a very young Mr. Spock. That's what Spock looked like on The Cage, the original Star Trek pilot, when he was an impressionable alien under Captain Pike. And that is not false advertising. This is the story of a spatial rift that opens once every 30-something years or so. And it opens and involves Pike's Enterprise at the beginning of this novel. For a good chunk of the beginning of this novel, we have Pike's Enterprise. Peter David writing Pike's Enterprise with Lieutenant Spock and Dr. Boyce and Number One, Pike's enigmatic first officer. And all of it is done with, Peter David has a kind of a very brio style. It's very quippy, it's very quotey, it's often very jokey. I've often criticized him by saying that he will move the whole plot 10 feet to the left just to stoop for a joke. He seems a little bit more in control in this book. No matter how many times I go back to him, I just don't think he's the writer for me. I really don't. I know that he has lots and lots of fans, mainly because his books are, I admit, even this one included, terrifically fun to read. They're really readable. There's, like, for instance, this book, a large chunk of it deals with and is set in the alien race that is on the other side of that spatial rift. David has imagined them. He has filled them with their own characters, their own society bits. That is a standard gimmick for Star Trek fiction, and it's usually deadly. Even in the hands of a really good writer, it's usually incredibly boring. Those chapters are usually incredibly boring. I understand why the old-style writers of Star Trek would throw themselves into those chapters, because those chapters are 100% invented, whereas when they're writing in the actual Star Trek continuity and they're writing these characters and these ships and these, do you want to get down, baby? These recognized planets, they've got corporate suits breathing down their neck. They're not totally free when they write those parts. And writers like to be inventive, even if it doesn't always show. So I understand why they throw themselves into those parts. Like, for instance, a famous example would be The Romulan Way by Diane Duane. Also going all the way back to The Final Gambit. Stuff like that. Older Star Trek novels just give you huge chunks of the alien cultures that Kirk and crew are interacting with. And Peter David does that, and he puts a lot of energy into it, but I think I'm not the only person to read this book and just be impatiently waiting to get back to the characters that we know. And there are quite a few characters that we know in here. Because after that initial encounter with that alien species, the Caligar, and with the spatial rift, 30-something years pass. And when it's next due to open, it's Captain Kirk, a seasoned Captain Kirk, and his crew, who are bringing a diplomatic delegation to the rift in order to make contact with this alien species. And one of the people that's doing it is Ambassador Fox, who was a pompous popinjay in a great old Star Trek episode. He's learned a thing or two in this book. He is more seasoned, slightly more Kirk-like. And another character who there are a lot of characters that crop up in here. Another thing that Peter David does really well is fan service, what we now call fan service. If you're a traditional Star Trek fan, his books are going to have lots and lots of stuff for you to notice and recognize. And one of the characters that he brings back here is Dr. Richard Daystrom. Such a magnificent turn in the original Star Trek series, where he is the creator of the circuitry that runs the Enterprise, but he's gone slightly round the bend, trying to outdo his wunderkind years. And he has a major role in this book, and it's wonderfully done. Better done than I remember. Actually, most of the stuff in this book was better done than I remembered. Particularly, oddly enough, Kirk, who is usually just a blank space in Star Trek fiction. Usually he is. Usually writers just don't get him. They just don't know what to do with him. They either make him some sort of strutting cardboard hero, or they make him, a non-entity, an administrative non-entity off in the background, while the quote-unquote interesting characters do stuff. And thankfully, Peter David doesn't think that. So here we get a really good character. In this case, I'm glad that Kirk has such prominence on the cover, even though technically you could put other things on the cover instead that have more prominence. For instance, there are two very well done characters here, made up for the book, an Andorian and a Tellarite, that are really, really well done in this book. Peter David's insight into what those races are like, based on very little, based basically on Journey to Babel. And the plot in the so-called present day of the novel involves Mr. Spock and his party being trapped on the other side of that rift, with the risk that it will close. That it may even close prematurely. Moving a mass the size of a starship through it tends to destabilize it. But even if you don't do that, it's still going to close. Periodically it opens and periodically it closes. And if it does, then Mr. Spock is on the other side of that rift for 30-something years. So there's a clock ticking, and that's handled really well here. I don't know if it was just that I was in a more forgiving mood last night, but or maybe it was just that I'm enjoying myself because I know I'm cheating, because this is mostly a Kirk adventure. The only reason that I'm doing it for Book Trek is because it opens with Pike. There's a significant chunk here with Pike that I thought was well done. That's my flimsy excuse for including this, even though it is in no way Strange New Worlds. So, I don't know, maybe I'll do the same flimsy excuse tomorrow as well. But today's, I don't know what it is, but my read of this book, my reread, I really liked. So that's my Book Trek report for today. I will see you tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.